Good morning, class. This is Mrs. Politsky, and these are your notes for World History, Chapter 14, Section 3. And if you've been gone the last few days because of FFA or FBLA and you do not have a packet for your Chapter 14 notes, please ask your sub. I have a few extra copies that you can use. Otherwise, follow along and fill in the information that you need. When we finish with the Section 3 notes, I have a little bit of information about life as a medieval foot soldier. You will have to draw the graphic organizer. And if I'm going too fast, you may want to ask your sub to occasionally pause so that way you can get everything written down. All right, with that, let's take a look at Chapter 14, Section 3. We're going to talk a little bit about art in the Middle Ages, and there may be some things here that look a little familiar as we go along. But in number one, the purpose of art during the Middle Ages was to show the glory of God. And the idea was not necessarily out of the ordinary. Churches for years have been kind of a pivotal part of any community, especially in Europe. But by the time we get to the high Middle Ages, kind of the end of the Middle Ages, architecture and building techniques are improving dramatically. And if we take a look at number two, the new Gothic churches were different from any kind of previous church built in the early Middle Ages in that they were much taller, they were brighter, because they featured things such as a flying buttress. And I just want to point out, the lines down here are pointing to a flying buttress. What it is an outside or an external support for a wall that you might see here at our church, or over here on our church, that for the most part allows for the walls to be a little bit thinner but much higher without necessarily having all the reinforced steel like we would have today. So nevertheless, thinner walls, stained glass windows. As you can see here, we've got a rose stained glass window. Pointed arches and vaulted or higher ceilings like you see here. And this allowed for more open interiors. Churches before this period of time, during the earlier Middle Ages, was not unheard of to see a church that would have walls that were at least 3 feet thick. So by allowing for these new building techniques, we could allow for much thinner walls, much higher walls, and allow for more light to come in. All right, let's take a look at number 3 and 4 here, and we're going to open this up a little bit. Great literary works of the Middle Ages were Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer, the Divine Comedy, written by Dante, and the poems of Hildegard Bingen, a nun who wrote in Latin in the language of the church. And speaking of the language of the church, as you all know, the early church, and really up until the time of Vatican II, Latin was the only language that we used. But what's interesting is when we were in the Middle Ages, you're starting to see kind of a shift away from that in certain parts of Europe into what we call the vernacular. And that's what's interesting about Chaucer and Dante. They wrote in the vernacular, which is the language of the people. And in a way, it's kind of representative of those people. And in a way, it allows them to have a great pride in those authors. So in the future, if you happen to be in an English class and you have to read Chaucer, or if you have to read Shakespeare, or maybe even if you tap further back to the ancient writings like Beowulf, you'll understand a little more of the vernacular. All right, moving ahead. Questions number 5 through 7. Within new universities, the subjects of Roman law, Greek philosophies, the works of Aristotle, and also Islamic writings were taught. Thomas Aquinas changed thinking in that he combined Christian faith with what we call rational thought. And he also began the study of the classical works, and which is kind of interesting because, for years, we can go back and we can find just very little that is being represented from maybe the old Roman Empire or maybe even the ancient Greeks. But by the time we get to about the 12th century, there is a desire to tap back into those ancient works. In a way, if you were a scholarly person, you would know those works inside and out. So scholasticism emphasized reason as represented by the classical philosophies and faith as represented in the Bible, and tried to reconcile these two together. And in a way, a lot of our monasteries were kind of combining these things, and that's going to lead the way for the establishment of universities that are run by the church. All right. What you're going to need to do right now is find some scratch paper, and we're going to talk a little bit about life of the medieval foot soldier. And each one of these circles in this graphic organizer or Venn diagram, it's more of a graphic organizer, I guess, is numbered 1 through 6. So, some things that we know about life as a medieval foot soldier. It wasn't necessarily all glory, but soldier was a human shield. But in many cases, our soldiers were, for the most part, very expendable. You set about in the warfare, and you probably, if I were a commander, I would probably assume many of them would not make it back. Many of our foot soldiers at this period of time were relatively poor, and they couldn't afford a horse. So that usually meant that they were on foot, hence the name foot soldier. Today we would probably call them infantry. And number 3, our foot soldiers were really the backbone of the military because they made up the largest portion of any army. When you talk about the amount of time that a soldier would be serving, roughly 40 days a year. Okay, now think about that. That's just a little bit over a month. You got to understand, for soldiers, many of them were not professional soldiers. They actually were probably farmers, maybe even, for the most part in terms of vassals, or maybe even a serf. And they had a limited time that they could be actually out in the field fighting. They had to get back and tend to their crops. So a 40-day year, that just kind of works around their schedule, I guess. Number 5, when you talk about weaponry, they may use a mace. Mace, for the most part, looks like a shot put with a lot of spikes on it that is held by a chain and a handle. And what you would do is you would kind of spin that around, and if you could hit somebody with it, then more power to you. Crossbows, daggers, swords, a billhook, which to me looks like kind of a little longer version of the bean hook that I used to use when I walked beans as a kid. And then an axe. And in some cases you might even see, your typical axe that you might use to go chop wood, or you might use a battle axe, which is kind of a double-bladed axe, a lot bigger than what you would use to chop down any trees or anything like that. But you would wield that to split a man in half. And finally, number 6, if you didn't report for duty, okay, you could have your land taken away. And if we go back and talk about what we know about land, land was like your status back in the old day. It wasn't so much, how many coins you had. It was, basically your ownership of land or your ability to have land defined your status in society. So if you had your land taken away, you would have everything taken away. All right. Thank you for following along. And a reminder, don't forget, to get your work turned in if you haven't already done so. We will be taking a quiz over Chapter 14 vocab tomorrow. Thank you.